Welcome, everyone. My name is Kevin Blankenship. I'm an assistant professor of Arabic and Middle East Studies here at BYU. And it's my pleasure to introduce the first session and the speakers. The title of our first session is Islam and Muslims in the Global West, Challenges and Opportunities. And let me read the sort of panel description just to set the stage. Due to the acceleration of globalizing forces, many forms of Islam have come into contact with secular democracies and cultures, resulting in complicated and dynamic social ecologies. Recently, ideological controversies and on-the-ground stresses related to refugees and immigration, retrenchment from globalization, the COVID-19 pandemic, and renewed calls for racial justice have impacted Muslims in particular ways. Participants in this session will reflect on these and other challenges and opportunities facing Muslims living in or aspiring to live in the West. So we have two distinguished speakers today, one of whom will be joining us from Zoom. Our first speaker is Esma Asfaruddin, who is professor of Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures in the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies at Indiana University, Bloomington. She's the author and editor of 8 books, including Jihad, What Everyone Needs to Know, Contemporary Issues in Islam, the award-winning Striving in the Path of God, Jihad and Martyrdom in Islamic Thought, recently translated into Indonesian, and The First Muslims, History and Memory, which has been translated into Turkish and Malay. Her research has been funded by the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, the American Research Institute of Turkey, and the Carnegie Corporation of New York, which named her a Carnegie Scholar in 2005. And in 2019, she was inducted into the Johns Hopkins Society of Scholars. Joining us by Zoom will be Sherman Jackson, who's the King Faisal Center Chair of Islamic Thought and Culture and Professor of Religion and American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California. Professor Jackson received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania and has taught at the University of Texas at Austin, Indiana University, Wayne State University, and the University of Michigan. From 1987 to 1989, he served as executive director of the Center for Arabic Study Abroad in Cairo, Egypt. I know that because I'm an alum of that program. He's author of several books, including Islamic Law and the State, the Constitutional Jurisprudence of Shihabuddin al-Qaddafi, Islam and the Black American, Looking Towards the Third Resurrection, and Islam and the Problem of Black Suffering. And Professor Jackson has been featured on the Washington Post Newsweek blog On Faith, as well as the Huffington Post.
Good morning, everyone. Greetings. Assalamu alaikum. I want to begin by saying how truly delighted I am to be here at Brigham Young University on this gorgeous campus, to be in the middle of these pristine mountains, and to be in the midst of some very good friends and colleagues. I want to especially recognize Professor Grant Underwood and the members of his organizing committee for inviting me to speak at this important event, and who have absolutely gone out of their way to extend warm hospitality to us and to make sure that our visit is as enjoyable an experience as it can be. There is no doubt that Muslims in the contemporary West face enormous challenges in practically every sphere of their lives. The most persistent and predominant of them has to be the challenge posed by the pervasiveness of anti-Islamic sentiments that have gripped many modern Western societies since the 20th century, and that has metastasized in the second decade of the 21st century into what is now known formally as Islamophobia. Although it has earlier roots, the term was made popular by a British think tank called the Runnymede Trust. In a report that it issued in 1997 titled Islamophobia, A Challenge to Us All, Runnymede Trust defined Islamophobia, now quoting from them, referring to dread or hatred of Islam, and therefore to fear or dislike of all or most Muslims. Hamid Dabashi has suggested that such anti-Islamic sentiments represent not so much of a phobia, which is a deeply rooted fear of uncertain or repressed origins, but rather a deliberately and consciously manufactured loathing systematically cultivated by right-wing extremists. It represents, he says, the transmutation of an entire people into a metaphor, categorically hanging on those interchangeable terms, Muslims and terrorists. September 11, 2001 is the watershed mark for the escalation in anti-Islamic sentiment in the global West. For example, in the United States, polls before September 11 typically showed that most Americans confessed ignorance about Islam and were more or less evenly divided between those who harbored positive views about Muslims and those who had negative perceptions about them. In roughly 2000, about 25% of Americans believed that Islam is inherently violent, while 51% disagreed. By 2011, these percentages had dramatically shifted. 40% of Americans were now of the opinion that Islam promotes violence, while 42% disagreed. A report from the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies, published in 2010, established that as many as 4 in 10 Americans, about 43%, confessed to harboring at least a little prejudice towards Muslims. This was more than twice as many Americans who said they were prejudiced in any degree toward Christians, 18%, Jews, 15%, and Buddhists, 14%. Muslim attempts to build mosques, especially in the rural South, have often been greeted with dismay and denounced as attempts to establish terrorist cells in the heartlands of America, as was the case in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, in 2012. Islam is delegitimized as a religion by Islamophobes and presented instead as a political ideology that is not entitled to protection under the First Amendment. The so-called war on terror, which single-mindedly focuses on Islam and represents Muslims as a civilizational threat to the West, continues to foment the spread of Islamophobia. The situation became far worse under the Trump administration between 2016 to 2020. Inflammatory rhetoric circulating on the internet and popular media, and increasingly adopted by government officials and members of the US Congress, led to a spike in violence against American Muslims in the first year of Trump's presidency alone. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, which tracks extremism in the United States, the number of hate groups active in this country rose for the second year in a row in 2016, propelled in part by the mainstreaming of far-right rhetoric by the Trump presidency, particularly on topics like immigration and Islam. The number of anti-Muslim groups grew the most, almost tripling to 101 in 2016 from 34 in 2015. In the first 10 days after Trump's election, the center documented 867 bias incidents, including more than 300 that targeted immigrants and Muslims. Anti-Islamic hate-mongering is also the province of certain think tanks, and I use the term advisedly, such as the Center for Security Policy, the Middle East Forum, and the Investigative Project on Terrorism in the United States. Typically, these organizations traffic in sensationalist rhetoric about Islam and Muslims, attempting to whip up public paranoia about creeping Sharia and about an assumed worldwide Muslim conspiracy to take over the West through the instrument of militant jihad. Rhetoric of this sort has helped to galvanize nativist and xenophobic political opposition to Western Muslims and brought Islamophobic politicians and political parties to power in a number of Western countries. Such rhetoric is not about to go away anytime soon. The American think tanks that I just mentioned are bankrolled by powerful donors like the Donors Capital Fund, the Russell Berry Foundation, the Lynd and Harry Bradley Foundation, among others, and constitute what the Center for American Progress has called the Islamophobia Network. These foundations contribute millions of dollars to Islamophobic organizations. Thanks to their largesse, such organizations have mounted very effective campaigns against Muslims, agitating against their presence and relentlessly vilifying their religion as one that promotes endless violence in the name of jihad. Some of their hate-mongering rhetoric has been adopted by right-wing Christian and Jewish groups and infiltrated the media, not just Fox News and the Washington Times, as might be expected, but also the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal, for example. What were once dismissed as fringe extremist views have seeped into the American mainstream and gained a certain legitimacy, especially after the 2016 presidential elections. Peddling hatred against Muslims has in fact become a powerful and profitable industry in contemporary America. Islamophobia has also gone into overdrive in a broad swath of Europe. In 2018 alone, France saw an increase of 52% of Islamophobic incidents. In Austria, there was a rise of approximately 74%. Polls document that 44% of Germans see a fundamental contradiction between Islam and German culture and values. A whopping 62% of the population in Finland express such sentiments, while in Italy, it is about 53% of the population. Forms of veiling have been banned in a number of European countries, including the hijab ban in French schools and the niqab or face veil bans in Denmark, Belgium, and France that restrict the religious freedom of Muslim women. When Anders Breivik, the Norwegian man who gunned down 77 people in 2011, described his massacre as motivated by the desire to prevent Eurabia, he expressed a common fear that Europe would become colonized by the dreaded Arabs and Muslims. This fear has only grown in certain parts of Europe since Breivik's act of terror. As a recent op-ed in the New York Times stated, to be a Muslim in Europe is to be mistrusted, visible, and vulnerable, and that from the street to the state, Islamophobia is baked into European political life, end of quote. Despite the pervasive talk of Islamic or Islamist terrorism, hard statistics provide irrefutable evidence that a violent extremist minority among Muslims is exactly that, a small minority that represents a sliver of the global Muslim population, now numbering almost 1.5 billion. In his 2011 book, The Missing Martyrs, Why There Are So Few Muslim Terrorists, the sociologist Charles Kurtzman documents that out of the approximately 150,000 people who die daily worldwide, fewer than 50 deaths occur at the hands of Islamist militants, and then mostly in the conflict-ridden areas of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq. However, hard facts do not by themselves readily dissipate impressionistically formed views. Constant and frequently sensationalist media coverage of acts of militancy committed by Muslim individuals contribute further to the hardening of negative stereotypes about Muslims in general. As a consequence, violence and disloyalty to the state are persistently associated with Muslims in the global north. One of the characteristic features of anti-Islamic discourses is the portrayal of Muslims as inherently anti-modern, since they are understood to be biologically programmed to hate democracy and root for theocracy. According to the master narrative prevalent in most parts of the global West, religion and modernity or democracy cannot mix. Secularism is a sine qua non. Ergo, religious people, particularly Muslims, cannot be good citizens. Their adherence to religious norms, especially the much demonized Sharia, renders them irrational and violent. Painted with the broad brush of irrationality, Muslims in toto are rendered as unfit to be proper citizens of modern Western societies. The pedigree of this fetishization of rationality as emblematic of modernity goes back to the late 19th century and the influential writings of the German sociologist Max Weber, who died in 1920, and whose views still hold sway in the contemporary West. Weber conceived of rationalization as a meta-historical achievement that is uniquely Western and that is lacking in other parts of the world, but available for adoption and emulation by others. Rationalization for Weber is a process occurring in different spheres of human life, in music, law, religion, art, etc., with their own internal logic and directions. As a result of this process, he says, irrational customs and traditions, including religious ones, are replaced by conscious, rational decisions based on the individual's self-interest. According to Weber, modern scientific and technological development results from rational self-interest and relentless secularization, which has given the Western world an edge over the rest. The influential anthropologist Talal Asad has written persuasive critiques of the Western project of secularism and its assumed universal and transferable character. He has skillfully dissected various discourses on secularism, in the course of which he lays bare what he regards as some of the disingenuous and parochial claims made on its behalf. For example, one of the persistent myths that has been circulated concerning the secular liberal state is that it is the most effective system to ward off conflict, particularly of the religious and ethno-nationalist type, and to promote a tolerant civil society. Assad disagrees. Secularism, he remonstrates, generates its own rigid orthodoxy and truth claims. Failure to submit to them sometimes elicits violent reprisal and political marginalization. The potentially hegemonic nature of secularism has sought to assert itself as an endemic feature of Western-style modernity, eliciting in its wake pushback from those who do not take kindly to having it imposed upon them. The particular historical encounters of specific people with modernity and secularism understandably color their perspectives on both phenomena and create resistance toward homogenizing narratives that do not match their own experiences and lived realities. This is certainly true of the Islamic world. As John Esposito, who we're very lucky to have in our midst today, has observed, in the context of the modern dynamics of political power, Muslim intellectuals and political activists frequently forge, and I'm now quoting from him, a connection between the secularist doctrine developed in Europe and European colonial expansion in the Muslim world with its legacy of non-democratic secular regimes in much of the Middle East and North Africa, end of quote. The social and political crucible in which Muslims are engaging the modern world is thus historically specific to them. Within the geographical region commonly referred to as the Islamic world, there is considerable diversity in the ways in which Muslim-majority countries are negotiating the challenges of modernity. Without doubt, as ample evidence can be marshaled, religion remains relevant in the various projects of modernization undertaken by Muslims today. This is true even in countries where the post-colonial and modernizing state has attempted to impose secularism on the population in recent history, as in Turkey, Tunisia, and Algeria. As public opinion polls and surveys conducted in a number of Muslim-majority societies have repeatedly shown, an overwhelming majority of their inhabitants continue to express positive attitudes toward both Sharia and democracy, for example, and advocate the implementation of both in their own societies, regarding them as mutually reinforcing. In fact, the continuing resurgence of religion in many parts of the world indicates that religion has not only not lost its importance in the public sphere today, but remains an essential ingredient in the crafting of modern individual and communal identities in many societies, particularly in the global South. In more recent times, religious identity has become intensely politicized in the public sphere in contemporary Europe and the United States, especially when such identity is asserted against immigrant Muslims in order to mark them as outsiders. As Olivier Roy noted recently, populist movements and the conservative right, sometimes joined by left-leaning elements, champion Europe's Christian identity in order to counter Islam. In March 2018, the German Interior Minister, Horst Seehofer, for example, loudly proclaimed, "No, Islam is not part of Germany." As Roy observes, in such anti-Islam discourses, Christianity becomes reduced to a shibboleth, so that it has very little to do with worship and spiritual values, and everything to do with setting cultural boundaries against those perceived as undesirable outsiders. Roy goes on to observe astutely that, quoting from him, lurking behind the debate over Islam are much deeper questions about the very nature of Europe and its relationship to religion in general, end of quote. The same weaponization of religious identity has occurred in the United States, born out of similar anxieties about an assumed pristine, homogeneous national culture in danger of being polluted by immigrants in general, but Muslims figuring prominently among them. In both Europe and the United States, religious identity is furthermore strongly wedded to racial identity, so that Muslims, along with other non-white, non-Christian groups, are rendered as doubly the other. The picture is not, however, relentlessly that of doom and gloom. If we shift our glance to particularly the United States, there are also unique opportunities for American Muslims to influence the global narratives that are spun together by so many vested groups that are antagonistic towards their very existence here. Unlike many Muslim communities in Europe, American Muslims tend to be among the most prosperous and highly educated segments of the US population. American Muslims are furthermore not a homogeneous group. Within the American Muslim population, there's a considerable diversity of ethnic groups represented. If one walks into a mosque in a large urban center during a congregational prayer, especially on a Friday afternoon, or during one of the two major annual religious festivals, one will find a veritable United Nations of members from various backgrounds represented: South Asian, Arab, Malay and Indonesian, African, African American, Bosnian, Turkish, Chinese, and others. Despite these considerable cultural variations, the large majority of American Muslims are, on the whole, socially and economically integrated into American society. Unlike Muslim immigrants to many European nations, many of the Muslim immigrants to the US arrived in the 20th century with advanced university degrees from their countries of origin, possessed fluency in English, and evinced a strong desire to adapt to their country of adoption without giving up their religious observances. Of course, we should not forget at the same time that Muslims had arrived as early as the 18th century in the Americas, many of them as enslaved people. About 10% of those enslaved at that time are said to have been Muslim, and most were of North African and West African ancestry in antebellum America. In the United States, American Muslim civil rights and advocacy groups are at the forefront of efforts to push back against Islamophobia and allow Muslims to represent themselves in all their diversity. Among such organizations are the Council on American Islamic Relations, better known as CAIR, the Muslim Public Action Committee, MPAC, the Islamic Society of North America, ISNA, and the Islamic Council of North America, ICNA, which regularly hold conferences, workshops, and information sessions to challenge Islamophobia, provide representation for Muslim citizens in the political and civil spheres, and advocate for the civil and human rights of American Muslims when they are violated in many ways. A number of these organizations provide internships for undergraduate and graduate students so that they may learn critical political and lobbying skills to make them more effective citizens. They, along with local mosques and Muslim communities, also engage in outreach to other religious communities and participate in interfaith activities in order to promote religious and political freedom and combat bigotry. They liaise with members of churches, synagogues, temples, and other houses of worship, and have established broad coalitions with different ethnic and special interest groups, representing, for example, Americans of Japanese, Sikh, and Hindu backgrounds as well, all of whom have similarly encountered cultural ostracism, racism, and violence specifically directed at them in American society. American Muslim groups also work hand in hand with secular civil rights and legal advocacy groups, such as the American Civil Liberties Union, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the American Bar Association, and others, to defend their rights as American citizens. CARE, in particular, keeps track of incidents of discrimination and violence directed at Muslims and provides much-needed counsel to those seeking legal redress against employers, for example, who discriminate against Muslims. These organizations also call out unfair portrayals of Muslims in the powerful Western media, which often play up violent acts carried out by those with Muslim names and background. An important study carried out at Georgia State University in Atlanta in 2017 found there was a 449% increase in media attention when the perpetrator of a terror attack was Muslim. And this conclusion was based on an analysis of coverage of all terrorist attacks in the US between 2011 and 2015. Muslims committed 12.4% of attacks during the period studied, but received 41.4% of news coverage the survey established. On the basis of these findings, the study concluded that various news outlets were making people disproportionately fearful of Muslims as incipient terrorists. By reaching out to journalists and television reporters and building relationships with them, American Muslim organizations impress upon them that context and the framing of news are important. Conscientious journalists who excel in their jobs should pay attention to both, even when laboring under strict deadlines. Journalists should avoid reductiveness in their reporting and treat Muslims as they would any other religious and/or ethnic group, with a regard for the complexity and depth of their identities and for the multiple interpretations of their religious traditions. Radicalism is, of course, not a problem uniquely confronting Muslims. All religious communities are grappling with some version of it in the context of secular modernity. This recognition has spurred a number of mainstream Christian and Jewish groups in particular to forge alliances with Muslim groups. Such mainstream faith groups are appalled by their right-wing co-religionists who indiscriminately malign Islam and Muslims. They seek instead to build bridges with Muslims on the basis of a shared understanding of the human relation to the divine and commonly held values of compassion, charity, and concern for social justice. Among such notable initiatives is the formation of a group called the Interfaith Alliance, composed of several Christian churches, Muslim organizations, and secular groups, that has recently redoubled its efforts to combat religious bigotry and promote religious freedom for all. Such bridge-building initiatives can be a powerful antidote to the forces of polarization. When the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh was attacked by a white nationalist gunman called Robert Bauer in October 2018, the Islamic Center of Pittsburgh and other concerned American Muslims, led by Tariq al-Masidi, started a fundraising effort called Muslims Unite for Pittsburgh Synagogue. They raised over $150,000 to help the victims of the shooting and their families, and to pay for the funeral expenses of the deceased. Al-Masidi is the founder of a Muslim charitable organization called Celebrate Mercy, and takes as his motto the Quranic verse, repel evil with what is better. This is from chapter 41, verse 34 in the Quran. As a result, Al-Masidi has built an impressive track record of helping people from different faith communities when under attack from hate groups. Good deeds have a way of boomeranging and creating a reservoir of goodwill that can be tapped into in times of tragedy and crisis. A few months after the Pittsburgh shooting, in March 2019, the An-Nur Mosque and Linwood Islamic Center in Christchurch, New Zealand, was attacked by an Australian white nationalist, Brenton Harrison Tarrant, during which 51 people were killed and many others injured. It was the deadliest mass shooting in the history of the country. In the outpouring of support that the Christchurch Muslim community received from around the world, we need to take note of one group that felt a special obligation to help, the Tree of Life members, who started a GoFundMe page with the initial goal of raising $100,000 to help the victims of the mass shooting in Christchurch. They remembered how Muslims had stepped up to help them in their hour of dire need the year before. Such acts of interfaith solidarity often do not receive, actually I should say hardly ever receive, banner headlines in newspapers. However, they do continue to happen below the radar and continue to mount a challenge to the master narratives of sectarian hatred and division in our time. So there is cause for optimism, perhaps modest at this time, that through active engagement and conscious efforts to challenge misinformation and disinformation widespread in the media and internet about Islam and Muslims, one can effect incremental changes in the way both are imagined, constructed, and represented in the global West. Call me Pollyannish, but I prefer to hitch my wagon to this star of hope, confident that only through such concerted efforts, waged by a broad coalition of like-minded people, can we hope to surmount bigotry and hatred and replace them with understanding and solidarity in the hopes of achieving some measure of social justice and parity, however elusive they may seem now. This effort, this struggle, or as many Muslims might be tempted to say, this jihad must continue. Thank you very much.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to, I really have to thank our technology assistant here at the University of Southern California, Jason, for being so kind to accommodate my my circumstances. He had to get up very early in the morning and get here and set everything up. And so I just want to extend my thanks to him. I also want to thank Grant Underwood and everybody there at BYU who contributed to the possibility of this conference happening. It looks really good on camera. I wish I were there. I want to start off with something that I haven't started off with in a speech in a very long time. And I'm hoping that the relevance to our topic will bear itself out. And I'm speaking here of an incident involving a figure of folklore in the Middle East by the name of Juha. Juha, if you're an Arab, he's an Arab. If you're a Persian, he's a Persian. If you're a Turk, he's a Turk. But at any rate, one day, Juha went to the mosque and he stood up at the rostrum to give a talk. And he said to the audience, do you know what I'm going to talk about? And they said, no. And so Juha said, well, if you don't know what I'm going to talk about, there's no reason for me to talk about it. And he left. The next day he came back under the same circumstances to give a talk to the mosque. And he mounted the rostrum and he said, do you know what I'm going to talk about? And this time they said, yes. And so Juha then said, well, if you know what I'm talking about, if you know what I'm going to talk about, there's no reason then for me to talk about it. And he left again. But he came back a third day and he mounted the rostrum, looked at the people and said, do you know what I'm going to talk about? And this time they figured they'd catch old Juha. And so half of the audience said yes, and the other half said no. And in that way, they were going to sort of trap Juha in his own game. Juha then paused for a moment, looked back at the audience and said, well, then let those of you who know tell those of you who don't know, and he left again. That's tempting. Now, Juha is in a sense almost sort of kind of relevant to the topic today in the following sense. Everybody assumes to know the West. When we mention the West, we assume that we know what we're talking about. We're talking about secular, liberal, post-Enlightenment, pluralistic democracies that value individual rights and freedom. That everyone assumes they know. That's sort of a given. What we presume not to know, what we don't know, or what very few of us are assumed to know, is Islam. And particularly how this foreign, sort of strange, pre-Enlightenment, pre-modern religion can acclimate itself to the West as we all know it. In some sense, the aim of this conference, and again, in some sense, might be described as being for those of us who know, that is Islam, to tell those of us who don't know, that is Americans or Americans, and then we can all just go home. It's really a matter of how we are able to bring society at large to an understanding of Islam that will then empower us to sort of get a sense of what the possibilities of Islam and Muslims fully integrating successfully in acceptable ways into American society. Now, I want to complicate this conversation a bit by challenging both the common understanding of the West and the common understanding of Islam and Muslims. I want to challenge the common understanding of the West as simply secular, liberal democracies. And I want to challenge the understanding of Islam and Muslims as simply, in a sense, the result of, just the latest chapter in the story of American immigration. I want to challenge both understandings of these two constructs, because in my view, it is only on a reconfigured understanding of both the West and Islam and Muslims that we will really be able to apprehend what is actually at stake in this whole business of the relationship between Islam and Muslims and quote unquote, the West. So now let me begin with the West. My challenge to the category or the construct of the West is actually in the way that we use the construct the West. We say the West oftentimes, when in point of fact, what we really mean is America, right? When we talk about especially Islam and its relationship to America, we often use the term the West, Islam and the West, as if the West and America were synonymous and coterminous. And what I want to do is interrogate, in fact, challenge that understanding. Because by continuing to use the West as a synonym for America, we conceal from ourselves seminal and unique features of America that fundamentally inform the question of how Islam and Muslims can or will relate to the West. And let me give you just one parenthetical example of a unique feature of America that will inform this conversation, as I hope to make clear as we proceed. America is the only major Western democracy in the world with a major contingent of native-born, in many instances, transgenerationally native-born Muslims. And I'm speaking here of the Black American contingent of the Muslim community in America. This fact, I think Black Americans make up perhaps the second largest single group of Muslims in America. And while the numbers may not be that big, this is unique among Western democracies. You don't have this in places like Europe, in England, in France, in Germany, right? In America, a major contingent of Muslims are native born, and as a people have been here for centuries, okay? I mean, we have to remind ourselves of the fact that at one point, the most famous person in the world was a Black American Muslim by the name of Muhammad Ali. The point of this will become clear as I proceed, hopefully. But one of the things that I want us to sort of acquaint ourselves with is the fact that this contingent of Muslims in America says something about the possibilities of American identity that we don't get when we just think of the West. And again, this will hopefully become clear as I proceed. Now, America, and this is again persistent to my challenge of the whole construct of the West, America is not and never was intended to be a simple extension of Europe. In fact, the German scholar of American studies, Joseph Yaffe, put it this way. He said, America was conceived with the idea of establishing something fundamentally new. Specifically, America was conceived of to be the un-Europe. It was an alternative to Europe. America was to be a motley collection of human beings gathered from all over the world, brought together to form a new political community. While the nations of Europe were bound, or at least could think of themselves as being bound by a single or common biological, linguistic, cultural, religious, and even psychological history, Americans as a whole are bound by none of this. We're too diverse for that. In fact, Americans are bound as Americans by an idea, and that idea is a political community held together by mutual subscription to a constitution. That is what America was conceived of to be, and that is why it could consistently accommodate people coming from all over the world, all of whom, in theory at least, could be equally American. But again, this is a part of America that I think many of us oftentimes overlook, and I'll allude to some reasons as to why as I proceed. But the fact of the matter is that as quiet as it's kept, precisely for this reason, it has often been very difficult for Europeans to even understand America. What is this thing? Freud, for example, when Freud came to America, the early decades of the 20th century, I think it was around 1909, Freud described America as, and I quote, a mistake, a giant mistake. How can you do this? All right? Hitler later on would diss America as a half Judaized, half Negrified society. And for him, this won't work. All right? It's too diverse. It's too variegated. It doesn't have enough of a common link. As late as 1973, Hannah Arendt, who herself was now a European immigrant to America, in an interview, she expressed, again, this is as late as 1973, she expressed how baffling she found America, right? Again, based on the idea that somebody who looks like me, and then somebody who looks like Donald Trump, and then somebody who looks like J-Lo, right? And then somebody who looks like presidential candidate Wayne, that they could all be just American? I mean, Europeans had a hard time understanding this. I think that as Americans, we often don't realize it, but this whole hyphenated identity thing we have going on, this makes no sense to Europeans. In Europe, for example, while we have Asian American, Asian American, we have Italian American, Arab American. There are no Asian French hyphen. There are no Arab French. There are no Italian French. There are French. And then ... Right? I mean, you have all these throwaway categories. But again, you're talking about a people who see themselves as descending from a common background, a common blood, a common history, a common psychological sort of orientation, as it were. And this is what it means to be a nation. That's not what America is. Now, part of the challenge that America has consistently confronted, precisely in this context, is that while America is not Europe, never was intended to be Europe, or even an extension of Europe, it has struggled from the very beginning with the impulse to homogenize, to try to forge a single social identity beyond the question of everyone's belonging to a single political community. By this, I mean, we have struggled with the idea of what is going to constitute a normative social cultural presence, a normative social cultural way of being that can be identified as normatively American. And we have tried to forge a single social cultural sort of public existence for America beyond the fact that we are a single political community. This is the vision of America that is captured in the image of, quote, the melting pot. The notion that everyone is supposed to somehow dissolve into a single American social cultural identity. Again, not simply politically, but also social culturally. The problem that this presents, and I think that at the time that this particular decision was made, it was not perceived of as a problem. But the problem with this comes in with the fact that the racial identity that was looked to inform or to underwrite this authentic American identity was whiteness. American authenticity as a social cultural identity came to be identified, equated with whiteness. And so American authenticity, again, beyond the question of constituting a single political community, right? To be authentically American somehow ended up related to whiteness. And we have to remember here, and some of us may not, the first congressional hearings that were held in America over the question of naturalization for immigrants, for people who are coming to America, and everybody was coming to America, was that part of the criteria for citizenship was that these people be free white persons of good character, right? That happened in 1790. We're going to accept as citizens free white persons of good character. Now, of course, under that criterion, Blacks, Asians, Native Americans, Latinos, others, they did not qualify for citizenship. Of course, later, this would change, and all of these groups would qualify for citizenship. Blacks, for example, became eligible for citizenship in 1877, around that time. But even as these other groups qualified for and eventually became citizens, their status as Americans in terms of their everyday quotidian existence at work, at school, at the gym, what have you, their status as Americans, both in terms of how they were perceived by others and then how they perceived themselves, would be informed by a social psychology that has shaped the minds and the sensibilities of the majority, going back to 1790. In other words, we would end up with a social hierarchy that was infused with racial connotations, even as we maintained legal equality. And this produced a social reality wherein some Americans ended up being more American than others, or at least as being perceived and perhaps even perceiving themselves as being more American than others. This exposed the American myth of e pluribus unum. I think it's still on the back of the dollar bill. E pluribus unum, meaning from the many, one. And it revealed, in the place of this American myth, the American reality of what Yale professor Matthew Fry Jacobson refers to as America's e pluribus duo. From the many, two. And the two were white and non-white. In earlier periods of American history, non-white essentially meant Black. Black was the quintessential non-white category. That's changed over the years, as we'll see as I proceed. Now, I know that for some of us, maybe many of us, this manner of presenting things may strike them as a sort of a Black man's history of America. But this, to my mind, is part of the problem. It's part of the tragedy. Because in point of fact, no one knows this history that I've just defined. No one knows it better and perhaps even more painfully than ethnic whites in this country. Ethnic whites who were at one time excluded from the category of whiteness and fought like hell to gain admission into it. The Irish know this very well. Read Ignatius, how the Irish became white. The Jews know it very well. Read Eric Goldstein, The Price of Whiteness. The Italians know it. Read Matthew Fry Jacobson's Whiteness of a Different Color. In fact, Arabs know it. My colleague here at the University of Southern California has a book entitled Between Arab and White, and it talks about the struggle of Arabs to gain admission into the category of whiteness as part of their attempt to get on the right side of e pluribus duo. In fact, I'll go even farther. I know I'm not there with you, I wish I were, but this conference is being held in Utah, all right? Earlier generations of people in Utah, earlier generations of Mormons know this history as well. In fact, I'm reading a fascinating book by Paul Reeve. And the title of it is Religion of a Different Color, The Mormon Struggle for Whiteness. This is America. This is a part of what it has meant to negotiate this landscape. And this is something that is not necessarily captured in this sort of vague, very, what's the word I'm looking for? It's very clean and washed over, the West, where we're just talking about democracy and secularism and constitutions and liberalism. That's not what this is. And early generations of America of all ethnicities know this very well. It is contemporary generations who don't necessarily know this, and for that reason don't know what they have contributed and what they continue to contribute to it, as a result of which we still struggle with trying to get America to understand what it means for her to come back to her truest self. And that is not as a European outpost of people who all hail from a single biological, religious, cultural, or ethnic, or even psychological history. America is the place of multiple authenticities. And so part of my point is, again, that when we talk about Islam and Muslims in the West, if what we're really talking about is America, then we cannot simply limit ourselves to conversations about secularism and democracy and liberalism and all these things. E pluribus duo has to be a part of the conversation, right? In fact, I'm going to close with some comments that I think will empower us to see E pluribus duo as part of the way that even Muslims can contribute to the whole enterprise of bringing America back to herself, as opposed to this drift into this flattening out of what it means to be an American. But now let me shift very quickly to the question of Islam and Muslims, right? It's important for us to note that E pluribus duo would exert an impact not simply on the relationship between Muslims and the dominant culture in America, but on the relationship between Muslims within the Muslim community, all right? E pluribus duo would affect that as well. And that's what I want to talk about in the last 2 minutes, which I hope I'll get a little bit of slack on, that I have remaining. Now, I can't cover everybody when I speak about the Muslim community. The Muslim community is so diverse, it's unbelievable. There are white American Muslims, Native American Muslims. In fact, I got an email from a sister a little while back who said to me that she was a Korean American convert to Islam. All right, there are all kinds of people who come into the Muslim community. And of course, I can't deal with all of them in what I'm going to present. But what I'm going to try to do is base my analysis on the three main groups of Muslims in America. And this is Black Americans, Arabs, and Asian Americans. And I want to try to do this by anchoring my discussion in 3 dates that I want to use sort of as props. And I don't mean these dates to be actually representative of detailed history, but you know, they're props that we can hang some hats on that enable us to keep up with the conversation. The 3 dates are the following: 1619, 1965, and 2001, right? 1619 is symbolic of the arrival of Blacks in the United States of America. Now, what's important about this is that this date begins its own sort of quasi-independent historical narrative and trajectory of which Black Americans, including Black American Muslims, remain a part. Black American Muslims are a part of a historical trajectory that precedes their actual coming into Islam, right? And here we have to remember that American Blackness was made not in Africa, but in America. And this is partly what people like James Baldwin had in mind when he said that Negroes, that's the word they used back in the 60s, Negroes don't exist anywhere other than in America. In fact, Baldwin referred to Black Americans as the world's first genuine Black Westerners, all right? I'm getting a note on my screen, Jason, I'm sorry. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. All right, so Baldwin identified them as the world's first Black Westerners, all right? Now, what's really important about this, however, is that the Black presence in America, partly because it goes back to 1619, all right, establishes the fact that in America, there is the possibility of multiple authenticities, multiple American authenticities. We do not have to be a single thing in order to be authentic Americans. No one asked Black Americans here today, where are you from? No one asked Blacks that. right? And no one is likely to tell Snoop Dogg, go home, right? Black Americans are part of that American landscape that's baked in. And part of the point that I'm trying to make here is that that establishes and maintains as an immovable fact that America is not and cannot be a single authenticity, all right? Now, it is well known that there were Muslims among America's slave population, all right? But Islam among Black Americans today is not a continuation of that slave past, right? They weren't able. The brutalities of slavery wiped Islam out among the slaves. In fact, Islam among Black Americans is largely a 20th century phenomenon. And what's important to note here is that while the conduits by which or through which Black Americans were reintroduced to Islam, they remain vague. What is not vague is that for Black Americans, Islam has always been called upon to assist them and how they could come to terms with living the reality of American Blackness. All right. Now let me switch to 1965. 1965 is the year in which the National Origins Act was rescinded. The National Origins Act, which goes back to 1924, was an immigration act that ensured that America would remain overwhelmingly white and Northwest European. The National Origins Act repealed that immigration formula and opened up the gates to immigrants from other places, including the Muslim world. And that's when we begin to get large critical masses of Muslims coming to America. Now, it is not my contention that there were no Muslims from the Muslim world in America before this date. That is not my contention at all. What I'm talking about, however, is the development of the critical mass, because post-1965 thing entails two issues. One is that, as I said, we get the critical mass. You get Muslims, coming to major cities, establishing mosques, establishing Islamic centers, establishing Islamic organizations, etc. All right, and this is, in a sense, a part reflection of the fact that they came to America precisely at a time when Islamic revivalism was afoot in the Muslim world. And just think of it in these terms, and I'm almost done, I'm gonna go too far away. The National Origins Act was promulgated in 1965. Sayyid Qutb, and I'm using Sayyid Qutb here symbolically as a symbol, as a symbol of the full arrival of Islamic revivalism in the Muslim world. He's executed in 1966. That's the period that we're dealing with. And so Muslims who come from the Muslim world at that time tended to be a lot more religiously conscious. Okay? Now, having said that much, Muslims who come to America from the Muslim world are coming from societies in which race is not the salient societal fault line. That distinction belongs primarily to one, religion, and two, social economic class. All right? In coming to America, Muslim immigrants, all right, would seek instinctively to do what every other immigrant group to America would seek to do, and that is to get on the right side of E pluribus duo. Many of them even qualifying from the beginning, being legally defined as white by the American government, all right? And so the coming of the immigrants would include a positive photo taxes towards American whiteness, pursuant to getting on the same side or the right side of E pluribus duo, just like all other immigrant groups did, Irish, Italians, and others. This, however, would place them at odds with the Black American community. Whereas immigrants are getting on one side of E pluribus duo, Black American Muslims are on the other side of that e pluribus duo. And this breeds tension within the Muslim community, right? There's also a class issue. Muslims who come from the Muslim world tended to be more educated, right? They came either with degrees or got their degrees here, went home and came back, or even perhaps even stayed, okay? Now, what we have to understand, and I'm just trying to, as the young people say, keep it 100, there's an extent to which, and I lived in the Muslim world for a number of years, there's an extent to which if you are educated in the Muslim world, there's a degree to which that implies Westernization, right? Upward mobility, in a sense, is facilitated by and is measured by your facility in foreign, particularly Western languages, all right? And so you have, even in their coming, a certain predisposal to aspects of the dominant culture that put them at odds with Black American Muslims, all right? Who tended to be from the lower classes within America, all right? Now, the last thing that is implied by all this is the problem of religious authority. Muslims who come from the Muslim world are presumed to know infinitely more about Islam than Black Americans, all right? These are people who speak Arabic or some other Islamic language. They have the advantages of transgenerational socialization in the ways of Islam, and therefore transgenerational instincts about what it means to be a Muslim that they might not even be able to articulate, all right, that Black American Muslims don't have. So this empowered that community to define what it meant to be a Muslim in America, all right, and to define the agenda of American Muslims, all right? And just to make a long story short, this meant that things like issues like Palestine or Kashmir would always make it onto the agenda. Affirmative action, police brutality, maybe not. Those are not Islamically relevant issues. And so here's the tension that e pluribus duo sort of injects into the Muslim community in this way, all right? Now, switch to 2001. I'm almost done, I promise. September 11, 2001 changed, I think, in some palpable ways, the internal dynamic of the Muslim community. Even Muslim immigrants who have been legally classed as white begin to see their legal whiteness give way to a social non-whiteness. In other words, even though they were legally justified in checking the white box on this or that form, they no longer experienced being perceived as white in the culture at large. And so while they have a legal whiteness, they have a social non-whiteness, all right? Now we begin to hear immigrant Muslims talk about the racialization of Islam. This is something that you begin to hear, all right? This was not heard back in the 1980s. Nobody talked about the racialization of Islam back in the 1980s or even the 1990s, all right? But now we begin to get the racialization of Islam. Of course, this baffles Black Americans where it doesn't offend them. I mean, what are you talking about? At any rate, we even find now immigrant Muslims increasingly identifying with the category of people of color. People of color. Not white, not Black, but people of color, all right? Now, I'm not sure if this represents a full or permanent switch from an identity with one side of e pluribus duo to an identity with the other side. I don't know if this is the case. But what is clear, and this is one of the impacts of 9/11, is that the Black experience has taken on more significance for immigrant Muslims than it used to by a long shot. I go back to the you didn't hear that, but a long time as a Muslim. And I can tell you, back in the 1970s, back in the 1980s, you would not have heard Martin Luther King quoted in any Friday sermon in any mosque, certainly not in any immigrant mosque. After September 11th, 2001, Martin Luther King, the civil rights movement, all of these things become germane and pertinent to the perceived plight of Muslims in America. And so 9/11, in a sense, has brought the Muslim community internally together in ways, all right, that they were not quite on the same page before, right? And this is part of, again, the dynamic of America and what E pluribus duo does, all right? Now, I want to be clear as I close now. I want to be clear. It is not my contention that pluralism or terrorism or secularism or liberalism or democracy or any of these things are not part of what must be negotiated, what Muslims must confront in negotiating their place in America. That's not my contention. In fact, I have personally written on every single last one of these topics as something that Muslims must address, all right? My argument is simply that as far as America is concerned, without E pluribus duo, we are actually not dealing with America. We are dealing with a caricature of America. And that, I think, will skew our analysis and leave us with a false sense of accomplishment and what we arrive at in terms of our conclusions. Let me conclude then with what may in some ways be taken as a controversial note, but this is a conference, and besides, I'm far away, you can't get to me anyway. In my view, more than any other group, the Black American community, by the very fact of that it cannot be alienated from America on the one hand, and it is unassimilatable in terms of a public identity. Even when Blacks walk the same, talk the same, have the same money as others, the physical semiotics, let's just call them, all right, will always mark them as another kind of American, all right? This to me has the effect of preserving America's ability to stay America, to preserve America's identity as America, and to prevent the Europeanization of America. And here I want to be clear. By Europeanization, I do not mean whitening. The issue is not race. I mean, well, it is, but it's not. You'll see what I mean in a minute. But I'm not referring to the whitening of America. What I'm referring to is the obliteration of the normativity of hyphenated identity for Americans. We are Arab Americans and Irish Americans and Italian Americans and Asian Americans. The Europeanization of America will wipe that out. Black Americans help to preserve America's identity as America. If, and this is a very big if Muslims now have found it to be the proper thing to migrate from the white side to the non-white side of E pluribus duo, then perhaps they too will come to be seen and to see themselves as actually contributing to the process of saving America from itself rather than being a threat to the republic. Thank you very much. And I guess I'm supposed to sit down now? Okay.
Thanks so much. Testing. Hello. Thanks so much to our two speakers for those informative and engaging talks. We'd now like to invite Dr. Sorry? Oh, someone checking something. Dr. Afsaruddin, physically to the stand, and I guess Dr. Jackson metaphysically to the stand, along with Professors Racialization and Masaroud, who will join us as interlocutors.
Okay. Oh, I forgot. I'm getting so used to it. Is Sherman joining us?
Sure.
Oh, right. I don't want to answer all the questions. He better be here.
Are we? Sorry.
I heard that.
Sherman, do you know what I'm going to ask you?
There it is. There it is. Juhaet.
You got it. Joha.
Where is he? Oh, there he is. Oh, okay.
Yeah, so feel free to go ahead and comment. I mean, I have one or two thoughts to jump out, but it seems like you already want to go ahead, so please.
Go ahead. Please. No, hello. Go ahead. Thank you.
There's so much here. Do you want to divide up and do Asma first and then Sherman, or do you care?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah? All right, I had stuff for Sherman first, but Asma, so your presentation was masterful, honestly, like covering so much history, topics, really situating this for the audience. Can you all hear me now better? Yeah. I was just saying that my friend Asma's presentation was really wonderful and really covered so much. I was struck by one of the many inspiring comments that I'm not going to quote it exactly, but it was something like, hard facts do not change emotionally configured views, right? So the FBI and others have said it is a fact that white supremacy is more of a national security threat than Muslim extremism, and yet there still is this pervasive fear and hatred of Muslims, specifically believing that something about Islam makes us more dangerous to the world and to the country itself and our national security. So I'm wondering, especially for an audience like this, how do you advise people have a conversation when encountering somebody like this, who has this unfounded fear, hatred, that is not grounded in facts? Do facts change their minds? Does it not? What situations have you been in? And so on. Like, for the audience here, you all are here. Some of you, it's the half and the half that Sherman was talking about. Some of you are here because you really do want to learn. You don't know very much, and you're coming here to learn. And others are coming sort of out of solidarity. You know a little bit. Maybe you're Muslim yourself, and you're sort of seeing how this is going. And I really think that the nature of this conference is, again, sharing information. So what advice do you have for non-Muslims who are in situations where they know what's being said is kind of wrong, but the facts aren't going to change their mind? And then on the other hand, what should Muslims say when we're put in a situation where our patriotism is challenged? So all the situations of Muslims running for office, they're accused of, how do we know you're not going to take over and turn this into creeping Sharia, etc. Zahid Qureshi, the recently confirmed first Muslim district court judge, was asked by a senator in the confirmation hearing, what do you know about Sharia? So these are the kinds of questions American Muslims are being asked. So what do you advise for both of those situations? What do we do in the face of unfounded fear, and what's the best way to respond?
That's really, really hard. And I don't think there's a single answer to these very important questions. It would depend on the circumstances. I'll take the easy answer first, in the sense that I'm going to speak from my own experience. So obviously, when I teach my own courses at Indiana University on Islamic studies, I get a lot of students who have absolutely no idea about Islam. They're a blank slate. They're actually much easier to work with. But there are students who come in with stuff they've picked out from the internet and media, and absolutely convinced that Islam is a dangerous religion. Muslims do pose a threat. I know this because I usually have my students fill out a questionnaire on the first day of class saying, why are you interested in taking this class? What are your expectations? And I've had a few students, not many at all, maybe 2 out of 40 students in a class, who might say, Islam is such a dangerous militant religion. I want to know what's firing this militancy, and how can we, one student actually went as far, how can we eradicate this danger? Actually, I welcome that, because I figured here is a nice, safe space where we can engage these questions. Students should not feel afraid to throw out these questions. It's in the back of the minds of many people. So here the facts do work. I mean, we go through historical, facts, the changing trajectory of Islamic thought. They get exposed to the diverse approaches to living and practicing their faith, by Muslims. The multiplicity of interpretations of key Islamic concepts. That, I think, is probably the most powerful and persuasive thing I can do in my classes. It's a much harder job for us to do, I think, as educators and as many of us who are in the role of public intellectuals, to deal with a non-academic audience. Now, I find when I do give public lectures, a large percentage of the audience do come in with an open mind. But then you have the people who practice, as some have described it, willful ignorance. They're not going to be persuaded by facts. They've made up their minds. They know what's true. You are just an apologist if you give them facts that are contrary to their assumed perceptions. Well, I don't have an easy answer to that at all, except maybe chip away at it. Think about this whole vaccine crisis, the COVID-19 situation. There are people who absolutely are convinced, even though they see people dying in droves around them, they're not going to change their mind. I don't know how to explain that willful ignorance, but it seems like if you're ideologically highly committed to a particular point of view, no amount of persuasion is going to dissuade you from that. So, but in the long run, I think education is going to be our best bet. I think it's going to be a generational thing. The next generation of students, I think, will be much more open-minded. Plus, the demographics are changing in the United States, so that your next-door neighbor is a Muslim, your teacher is a Muslim, your grocer is a Muslim, right? So you don't see them as someone as constituting a threat from afar. They are part of your community. So over time, I think a lot of those entrenched perceptions will inevitably change.
Can I ask a question here? And I want to preface it by saying I agreed with everything you said on a molecular level. I mean, there's not a single thing you said that I disagree with. Yeah. But I also think we're probably not going to learn very much if we sit up here and agree with each other. So let me play the heel a little bit and try to offer what I imagine the toughest critic of the view that you just articulated would offer. And I will stipulate again for the record, I don't think this. But they would say to you, come on. You are talking about a, quote, deliberately and consciously manufactured loathing of Islam, as if it's something that a bunch of malicious actors decided to cook up because they have just an irrational hatred of Muslims. As if, for example, 9/11 didn't happen. As if, for example, the attack here against the gay nightclub didn't happen. And we could name a whole bunch of other things that happened that would generate this quite understandable fear of Islam among average Americans. And what we seem to be doing is partaking of this discourse that's maybe pretty popular in ivory towers, which is to say, oh, well, there's this massive swath of racists out there, and this is just one more way in which Americans are exercising their racism, without actually engaging in the hard introspection about some of the ways in which our community does not necessarily stand up as much as it should against terrorism, or explains violence away with anti-colonial justifications, etc. So what would you say to that person who would render that, who's not Tariq Masood? Go ahead.
First of all, that quote you just repeated, that's not mine. I was quoting someone else. I think that was Hamid Dabashi, I think.
Yes, it was Hamid Dabashi. Thank you, yes.
I was just putting out definitions of Islamophobia that are out there, Runnymede Trust being, I think, the most universally accepted definition of it. I would say, Tariq, that I also agree with you here. Certain events have happened, and Islam gets implicated, right? And there are Muslim actors out there who claiming that their faith actually propels them to carry out these acts of violence and terrorism and so forth. We have to face that, right? Sometimes people will argue with me, saying, why even bring theology into your discussion of what's going on? I said, well, if you don't, they get away with their interpretation and there's no pushback. So again, the best defense against that is to show that there have been demonstrably different interpretations, the same verses, the same hadiths that you're quoting to make a case for terrorism. And it's something I actually really enjoy doing because it's made me acquainted with the large sweep of hermeneutical interpretations that are out there throughout history. And that history needs to be resurrected by Muslims themselves, right? Only they can do it. Absolutely agree with you. You cannot run away from these hard questions. You have to face them smack on. And there are good answers to be provided, but educators above all, I think, have to provide those good answers.
I think actually Sherman's presentation here was really complicating this a lot because, Sherman, you made such a, I mean, as usual, impressive way of saying, look, Muslims are not all immigrants. Here's this other history. Here's people who have been in this country for many, many centuries, and we're here too. So I think just the idea of this foreign sphere itself changing in our mind if we take seriously the role of African-American Muslims. And actually, now here's my question to you. So this idea of America as a political idea shifting at some point into whiteness as the calling card of what it means to be Americans. I've heard lots of people talk about the latest surge in white supremacy is like the last battles of the Civil War, sort of pushing for what is America? Is it white? Is it not? Is it something else? Is it this hyphenated reality that you're describing? And their quotes, what is it, like 2030, 2050, we're not going to be a white majority. There will be won't be a single majority in the country. And even I think now Protestant Christian is no longer the majority religion. So we are fast moving into a reality where there will not be a white majority, and not everybody's happy about that reality. So I'm wondering, Sherman, what do you have to say? What does that mean? What does it mean for Muslims in America as a part of that? Keeping in mind everything you said about the Black American and the Venn diagrams of categories here that include Muslims and Black Americans. And then I'm just thinking about a colleague of mine works in my law school. He's from South Africa, and he has a very different attitude about Muslims growing up in South Africa. I've heard from him and other South Africans that the Muslims who joined the ANC anti-apartheid movement took a very strong position of don't call us colored, call us Black, like identifying in solidarity with the most oppressed, and that changed the attitude of Black South Africans about Muslims as part of their community. So I'm wondering, Sherman, you talked a lot about sort of thinking about this reality of hyphenated America as actually America, and like identifying as Italian Americans, Chinese Americans, Asian Americans, African Americans, Muslim Americans. I'm wondering if you think that we should push for that or push for we're all part of an oppressed reality that this, what the Muslims in the ANC did, was that the thing to do, or is it to push for the more of the hyphenation? And then what about biracial people like me, who's multi-hyphenations? What's the role of Muslim Americans in this move to this multiracial, multi-reality America? And can we help in the truth and reconciliation process that we do need to go through?
Well, Asifa, I mean, your question was multifaceted. Let me just take one part of it, and maybe we can expand on that. I want to be clear about something. I think your question involving the South African Muslim. I mean, I think that's pertinent. That's a good question. But in some sense, it reflects a mild, perhaps misunderstanding of the whole point of what I tried to present. My point was not so much about how Blacks or Muslims can position themselves in a way that makes them more effective in pursuing their own interests. Although, of course, I believe in that. But my point was a larger point, which was mainly how Blacks can be looked to as the moment of preserving the possibility, indeed the reality, of multiple American authenticities. Because the demographic changes that you talked about in terms of ultimately arriving at a point where white people become the minority here, all right? I think we're going to have a very difficult time as a country if what we're talking about is shifting from authentic to inauthentic. And this is precisely why we have to preserve the possibility of multiple American authenticities. And this is where I see the difference between America and Europe. And I may be wrong there, but this is where I see it, all right? And so Blacks are symbolic in that way. And this is not simply about trying to promote the Black community as sort of the model community. This is an investment in American history. America did this, all right? And now that we're facing the kinds of changes, including the demographic changes that you spoke of, all right? What is it in our history that we can call upon that will assist us in navigating that development? And I think that, quite frankly, we're in a very dangerous moment now because many, particularly working class whites, they perceive that. You recall the slogan of the rally in Virginia that killed that woman: Jews will not replace us. And so what that is bespeaking is the understanding that American authenticity is a zero-sum construct. There is one authentic American and everybody else is inauthentic. And we are not going to be replaced as the authentic American. That is what I think that we have to focus on in terms of what we contribute to the ability of America to recapture herself. And that's the role that I see Blacks playing in that. Nobody's going to tell Snoop Dogg.
Can I put together your point? And what I just want to remind us is that Muslims ourselves are multi-ethnic, multiracial. So to participate in that conversation of reinforcing this multiplicity that is America, I'm just imagining, like, it sounds like you're saying every hyphenated American should own that hyphenation and be very vocal about it, be obvious about it. Is that part of what you're saying here? And so Black Americans say, I'm Black American, African American, Italian American, Asian American. So that's sort of the picture you're saying. Going forward against this push for whiteness as the definition, if everybody claims their heritage, no matter how far back it goes?
Well, look, part of what I'm saying is that I'm not in the business of telling this group or that group how they should identify. As I said, I find Muslims now identifying as people of color, all right? That was not the case 30 years ago, all right?
But is that good or bad? That's what I'm trying to get at. Do you like the generalization, or do you think...
Again, how communities choose to identify themselves is up to communities themselves. Sure. What I want to maintain, all right, is an overall context in which the fact that I happen to differ from X, Y, or Z does not diminish my authenticity as an American.
Okay.
Professor Masarodi had a question.
Thank you so much. Professor Jackson, I just first wanted to thank you for your remarks and to echo what I said to Dr. Afsaruddin, which is that I agreed with everything you said on a molecular level. I thought the point that you made about Muslims now in America talking about themselves as a racial category to be a very intriguing point, because I've certainly seen it myself. And here I am going to be a little bit confessional. I don't like it. And I feel like part of the reason I don't like it is because it's, many immigrant Muslims, our relationship to this country is very different from the relationship to this country of, say, a Black American who's the descendant of enslaved peoples. And I wonder whether you would think I'm wrong in saying that a Black American who's the descendant of enslaved Africans has a claim on this country that I, as an immigrant, actually don't have, because I showed up here voluntarily, and I can't make a claim that this country needs to change in certain ways to accommodate me. I actually have to change to accommodate the country a little bit. What am I getting wrong there?
Well, I would say, Tarek, I mean, you posed the question like this, so I'll just answer it like this. What I think you're getting wrong is the idea that you're not asking the country to change. That's who America is. That's what it's always been. We are a racialized society. There are other societies that are tribal. We are a racialized society. Henry Adams, the grandson of President John Quincy Adams, said explicitly, to try to do American history without the clue of race is to produce nursery rhymes. That's who we are as a country. And the challenge that we have is how we come to own that fact in a manner that's not prejudicial to any of us. And I think that one of the most dangerous, and this is what we find now, one of the most dangerous phenomena is, you know, a racism that hides behind racial agnosia. So we don't dislike these Muslims because they semiotically pollute the social space, all right? We don't like them because they can't get with democracy. We don't like them because they're not secular, all right? Blacks, Latinos, Native Americans have been secular, have been for the Constitution, have been forever. And yet they still face the plight that they face. And so for me, it's really a part of how we get honest in terms of America. And, you know, when I travel to, you know, the Middle East and other places, I do recognize I'm in somebody else's country and they have, you know, ways of doing things that might not fit my liking, but I'm in their country and I need to be respectful of that. But Tarek, I don't think that for you to say, there is this e pluribus duo here. What do I do about it? I don't think that you're bringing something to America from outside. I think you're just recognizing it for what it is.
Can I just very quickly just have a follow-up on that? You know, Professor Jackson, I mean, I think that, you know, when you describe the nature of American racism as a kind of negative sentiment towards people because they view those people as polluting, you know, I am not sure that is equally true of all quote unquote minority groups in this country. So I think you're absolutely correct that America has, or many Americans have had this view towards Black Americans. But for example, you for example brought up the experience of Catholic Americans and the experience of Americans from the LDS Church. And if you look at what, say, the Ku Klux Klan was doing with Catholic Americans, it wasn't saying that it wanted Catholic Americans to have their own schools. It's the Klan's problem, and I know this from Sahar Aziz's new book, The Racial Muslim. The Klan's problem with Catholics was that they were in their own schools, and the Klan wanted them to be in the schools of the Protestants so that they could indoctrinate them. They never wanted Black kids in the same schools. They wanted Black kids out. And so I do feel that there is a real difference. And in fact, when I, as a Muslim, show up and try to claim that my struggle and my challenge is exactly the same as the struggle of my Black brother, I'm actually not right. I'm not, you're shaking your head, so I'm clearly wrong there too. I'll shut up.
No, Tarek, I never said that you should claim to be Black. And again, the focus on Blackness as sort of the victim here, that's a misunderstanding of everything that I presented. Yes, they're victims. That's not the focus of what I'm saying, all right? What I am saying is that the fact that they are inalienable and at the same time unassimilatable represents the possibility of multiple American authenticities. That is what I'm saying that you should identify with, not with my history as a Black American, which is not your history.
I can't tell you how much I would love to continue this conversation. And I hope this conversation does continue in an unofficial kind of way. But unfortunately, the official session needs to be cut off here. I want to give a warm round of applause to our presenters and our interlocutors once again for their insights.